For more, we're joined by Peter Andersen, founder, Andersen Capital Management. Peter, thanks for your time this morning. So Scott Bessent saying that, he's prepared to expand that buyback plan. Will that make a difference materially when the underlying issues are still there? And, the 30 as well as we saw, it climbed back up above 5.2% despite the Treasury's announcement.
Yes, initially we saw that Treasuries did react positively to the announcement, but then, as you said, that was fleeting and yields backed right up again. So it's a complex situation in that he's signaling to the so-called bond vigilantes that the Treasury is willing to step in and somehow aid the direction of yields. However, we don't think that that is a long-term solution, and I think the market has shown us that today with yields backing back up.
Yeah, and Scott Bessent also saying that, okay, the current yields don't really reflect the U.S. economic fundamentals, and then why is it making such a move? How telling is it about how concerned Washington actually is about the nation's borrowing costs?
Well, it's interesting, too, because when you have the Secretary saying that the yields are not the appropriate level of yields, I mean, that is one person's opinion, with all due respect to the Treasury Secretary. However, that is one person's opinion as to where yields should be. As we know, where yields are the reflection of many, many voices out there in terms of where we think the equilibrium point should be at any time. So I think it's a bit superficial for one person to say, I hereby declare that long-term yields are too high, and as a result, I'm going to buy back some of those treasuries in order to bring those yields down. I mean, supply and demand is a factor, but I think that the amount of purchasing just isn't enough. It would have to be an enormous amount of purchasing, I think, to actually have an impact that Mr. Bessent was expecting.
Yeah, and Peter, how much of whether Scott Bessent succeeds in taming the bond market can actually affect the Fed's monetary policy? Because obviously if the Fed wants tighter financial conditions, Scott Bessent's move kind of already achieves that. So what is left for the Fed to do?
Well, I think there's a lot still left for the Fed to do, and certainly they want to exercise, if anything, I think this should put more of a focus on the Fed's independence. So we have the Secretary of Treasury opining about where he thinks yields should be, and I think it would be inappropriate for the committee to yield, no pun intended, to the Secretary of Treasury's opinion. So I'm hoping that the independents of this committee will have their own opinion and not really bow to the activities that were taking place recently.
Okay, and also, the moves coming at the expense of the dollar. What are the risks with that, you think?
Oh, of course, it's very much connected. And so when somebody makes an official statement like that, certainly it impacts the worldview of the U.S. dollar. So I'm certain that he took that into account. However, his actions signal to us that he is more interested in the level of the yield of treasuries than he is right now in the value, the relative value of the U.S. dollar. Incidentally, he also mentioned during his statement that the U.S. government is increasingly competing with the borrowing of corporate artificial intelligence issuers. So that's the first time that's actually come out. And I think that's fairly significant because we have the Secretary of Treasury now stating that the enormous demand for capital and the databases and all things artificial intelligence now are actually encroaching upon the competition for buyers of U.S. treasuries.
So how much are these higher bond yields then changing the investment case for those expensive tech names?
Yeah, I think that, we trade U.S. corporates what we call spread, which is, a relative valuation over the Treasury. So if the Treasury yield increases, certainly that spread will also increase in kind. So whenever you have rising yields, you will certainly have more expensive borrowing from the corporate issuer. So all around, the end result of this is everybody does better when you have lower yields. And I commend the Secretary of Treasury to be focusing on that. However, it's a more complicated solution. And I think a one-person solution of buying back a certain tranche of long-term treasuries is probably not going to have much impact, sadly.
All right, Peter, appreciate your time today. Peter Andersen there, founder, Andersen Capital Management.